people can bring things to NEPRA, and NEPRA can help out on climate issues that affect your neighborhood or your organization. We want it to be a partnership through and through. And so I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alejandra to talk about our State of the Estuary report and kind of the early findings we have from that.
Great, thank you, Sean. So just want to start out this section by giving a little bit of who we are and why we're here, about the trustees. For those of you who are not familiar, the trustees of reservations is a land trust organizations, and we have properties all over the Commonwealth, but our focus is really on preserving what we call special places, that are places or properties that we deem special or valuable in terms of their ecological, cultural, and historical value. And why we're here partnering with NEPRA, we have a pretty extensive experience with salt marsh restoration, particularly in the North Shore, where we've been doing salt marsh restoration projects for the last almost decade in the Great Marsh, which is the largest marsh in New England. And we really wanted to help catalyze other efforts in salt marsh restoration statewide. So really here more as a partner and support to NEPRA than anything else. So thank you again for having us here. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Sean. So a little bit of intro and background to the state of the estuary. As Sean mentioned, this is kind of a phased project so far, and our team members will talk about the second stage of this work. But in this initial stage, we wanted to really lay the groundwork for our modeling and design efforts that'll come later, with a pretty comprehensive salt marsh health assessment of the Neponset River estuary. To do this, NEPRA and the trustees worked together to secure some funding from an earmark from the Division of Ecological Restoration, and then thus hired the Woods Hole group to carry out the work, some of whom are here today. This baseline overall was really meant to help us understand what the marsh conditions are currently, particularly to identify specific marsh stressors and different areas of vulnerability in the marsh, based on historic activity on the marsh, but also on current environmental conditions. So really focusing on what it looks like now, what is the health of the current salt marsh extent, but also taking a step back and looking at what the historic extent of marshes and kind of what has led to what we have currently. Next slide, please. Some of our key findings from this report, and this report is still a little bit in progress, but mostly done, and the key findings are really there and really thorough. So our overall historical impacts, invasive species, and altered hydrology stand out as the main stressors that are affecting the marsh within the estuary today. And even though the stressors are varied, they really compound to result in a marsh that has kind of a mosaic of vulnerabilities, which is true of most urbanized or very highly developed marshes in the region. And so because of this, there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to restoration, which means we have to target it in a lot of different ways, and we have to do models that encompass a lot of different factors, which is always difficult. When it comes to historical impacts, some of the most prevalent ones throughout the estuary are fill, ditching, and just different elevated marsh platforms from said fill that have altered the ecosystem. We also have pretty significant erosion in some portions of the marsh, and just overall loss of marsh extent from development. Also, if we have invasive species, Phragmites, which is an invasive reed. If you've ever driven along I-93 and seen the Neponset estuary on your right or left, the grass that you see there, that's most likely the invasive Phragmites. And even though it looks great, if you're not aware, it is sadly invasive. Also hydrological issues. These just permeate marshes in New England, based on historical practices of ditching and mosquito control that have kind of left us with this network of ditches in our marshes that impact the way that water basically is able to flow into the marsh and flow out of the marsh. So there's a combination of pooling, but also not enough water coming into the marsh in some areas. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but basically water is not flowing in and out of the marsh as it naturally would because of all of this ditching and because of all of the berms and embankments that have been built over time in such a highly developed marsh. This is particularly impacting the vegetation, these kind of hydrological barriers in the upstream, which is the southernmost portion of the estuary here. And then overall, just sea level rise. I know we're taking a look at kind of a snapshot of the marsh now, but we're still looking forward as to how these current stressors are going to play out with sea level rise. And that's more what we'll do in the next phase, but still thinking about it at this phase, everything's going to be, squeezed up as water comes up, and we don't have as much room to migrate in such a developed area. So that's something that this report also looked at, how coastal squeeze is going to threaten our current marsh habitat. Slide. So this is some example figures from the report, which are really great at kind of encompassing what the report is looking at. The map on the left-hand side is a great kind of snapshot of a lot of the historical impacts that the marsh has gone over, everything from embankments and berms to areas of fill, areas that were previously marsh but have since been developed into commercial or residential developments. Also areas of dredging within the estuary are marked down in this report. So really something that if you're curious about a specific activity that has occurred within the estuary, this is just going to be a great report that is going to be publicly available for folks to be able to go and explore it as to what impacts have really affected the marsh. Another really great aspect of this report is the vegetation cover type mapping that was done of the area. As you can see in this map in the top right, there is really extensive Phragmites, which you see in yellow in the upstream portion of the marsh. So really just denoting that high abundance of Phragmites, which we knew, but kind of being able to quantify that within this report was really useful. And then, as I mentioned, the agricultural ditches can be seen on the lower right-hand side. So that exercise of ditch mapping and embankment or berm mapping within the estuary is really useful at determining the extent at which this estuary is being impacted by that altered hydrology. I can move on to the next slide. Thank you. Another thing that the report does really well is break down everything by reach. I've been referring to things like downstream reach, middle reach, and upstream reach. Downstream being northernmost. So again, it's a little counterintuitive, but some of the key stressors that were noted here in the downstream reach were tidal restrictions, edge erosion, and some ponding that is destabilizing the marsh platform. So the vegetation or grasses that are growing on the surface of the marsh. In the middle reach, some of the most notable stressors were continued to be edge erosion. I think they were primarily strong in this reach of the estuary. Extensive ditching and development that's limiting habitat expansion. So there's really not a lot of places for the marsh to migrate into, and therefore we're getting that coastal squeeze. And then in the upper upstream reach, we have a pretty extensive berms and fill that is blocking tidal flow. And what this report looks into is how that impacts how the invasive species Phragmites is able to dominate that area. Slide, please. So what are some of our remaining questions and data gaps? What really, there's so many influencing factors in this estuary. And so what we're really, the key question here is what really is driving the dominance of Phragmites or this invasive reed grass within the estuary, whether that's the marsh platform elevation, which has been artificially enhanced from fill and dredging activities or berm activities, or is it salinity? And so it could very well be both. So we're trying to look at how this will impact how the existing marsh habitat will perform under sea level rise scenarios. And that's what will be looked at in the next phase of work. So that's kind of one of the key questions, remaining questions that was raised by this report. We know the extent of Phragmites, we know the stressors that are impacting it. And so we just really want to kind of narrow it down to be able to address it in the following stages. The other remaining question is the extent of historic fill on the existing marshes. We have a really great picture of how much fill there is within the marshes and kind of where an approximate timeline, but I think we'd love to clarify that timeline a little bit further and then potentially down the line have some sediment characteristics, which we haven't been able to acquire at this stage of the work. And then finally, just identifying some marsh migration corridors in such a densely developed urban area. Like we mentioned, there's not a lot of places for the marshes to go. So just that remaining question, which might not have an answer, is where are we going to plan for the marsh to go or that flood pathway to be if we are planning for marsh migration to be one of our restoration alternatives. We can go for the next one. Thank you. So no solutions at this stage have been selected to move forward to design yet, and we still have the second phase of work in the modeling efforts. But based on this initial salt marsh health assessment, Woods Hole Group put together for us a list of kind of preliminary potential restoration actions that would target the stressors that we're seeing affect the marsh currently. Overall, these are really targeting, as I mentioned, the tidal flow and the hydrology and the invasive species control, and what we see as ditch remediation, which you see that activity being performed in the top two images, which is what we have been doing a lot in the Great Marsh and the North Shore, which is really remediating or healing those ditches that have been implemented for agriculture and mosquito practices to restore that natural hydrology to the marsh. So again, a sort of a laundry list of potential restoration solutions that we'll need to narrow down, both in terms of feasibility, cost, but also just what's going to be most effective in this environment. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways and some next steps, which will continue the conversation. Some of the data gaps that we identified in this report will be addressed in the next phase of work, but then some of them might remain just because we don't have the capacity or we don't have the information available to answer them yet. Our restoration focus overall, really what this report is telling us is hydrology, invasive species, and just overall marsh resilience to sea level rise should be our main focus as we move forward in planning for restoration. And as Sean mentioned, this is not kind of a one partner, one solution. It's going to need to be a collaborative effort among different stakeholders, among different agencies, individuals, groups, etc. Because the environmental stressors really need to be addressed along with urban planning. It can't be kind of two efforts moving along side by side. And so again, sort of definitely not a one size fits all solution, and we're considering several different options to target the stressors that we're seeing on the marsh today.